I didn't realize I was waiting. That's the strangest part. I wasn't standing still in an obvious way. I was moving, progressing, checking boxes, doing what came next. From the outside, my life looked active, intentional, even ambitious. But underneath all of it, there was a quiet assumption guiding every choice I made. Not yet. Not yet isn't fear. Not yet isn't doubt. Not yet sounds reasonable. I told myself I would start living fully once certain conditions were met. Once I was more stable. Once I knew more. Once I felt more confident. Once I had something solid beneath my feet. I wasn't avoiding life. I was preparing for it. At least, that's what I believed. Every desire came with a delay attached. I wanted things, experiences, changes, honesty, freedom, but I always postponed them. Not forever. Just until the timing was right. Later became my most used word. Later, when things calm down. Later, when I'm more prepared. Later, when I deserve it. That word felt harmless. It let me dream without committing. It let me imagine a future version of myself who would finally be ready, more capable, more grounded, more allowed. I trusted that version more than the one I was. I lived as if my current self was provisional. A draft. Someone who needed improvement before being taken seriously. So I postponed decisions that mattered. I softened my opinions. I delayed changes that felt risky. I waited for signs, approval, clarity, certainty, that never fully arrived. I told myself I was being patient. I didn't realize I was outsourcing responsibility for my life to an imaginary future moment. People around me moved on. They made choices, took risks, changed directions. Some failed. Some succeeded. Some surprised themselves. I watched. Not with envy, with restraint. I believed they were braver, or luckier, or more decisive. I told myself my time would come too. I just needed to be ready. That belief comforted me. It also trapped me. Because readiness is a moving target. The more I learned, the more I realized how much I didn't know. The more stable I became, the more I feared losing that stability. The more capable I felt, the higher my standards grew. I kept raising the bar for when life could begin. I didn't notice the cost right away. Days still passed. I still functioned. I still participated. But everything felt slightly muted, like I was experiencing my own life through glass. I was present, but not invested. Engaged, but cautious. Alive, but waiting. There were moments when something inside me stirred, an urge to speak honestly, to choose differently, to step outside the safe narrative I had built. And every time, I hesitated. Is this the right time? Am I ready for this? What if I regret it? Those questions didn't sound irrational. They sounded wise. And wisdom became my excuse. I confused caution with depth. Preparation with maturity. Delay with self-control. I didn't see how passive it made me. I remember a small moment that still lingers. Someone asked me what I would do if there were no constraints, no expectations, no fear of mistakes, no one to disappoint. The answer came to me instantly. And then I dismissed it just as quickly. That's unrealistic, I said. What I really meant was, I'm not allowed to want that yet. I had built an invisible authority over my life. A voice that decided when I was qualified to want things, to act, to change. That voice never said yes. It always said, soon. I didn't feel miserable. That's what made it dangerous. I felt reasonable. Responsible. Controlled. But deep down, there was a quiet ache I couldn't explain. A sense that time was moving, and I was staying just behind it, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid consequences. I lived in preparation mode. Always improving. Always adjusting. Always almost ready. And one day, without warning, a thought surfaced that refused to be silenced. What if no one is coming to give me permission? That question landed heavily. Because if it was true, if there was no moment of arrival, no external approval, no final readiness, then something terrifying followed. It meant that all this waiting wasn't strategic. It was optional. And if it was optional, then I had been choosing it. Once the thought appeared, what if no one is coming to give me permission? I tried to reason my way out of it. Surely that wasn't true. Surely there were legitimate reasons for waiting. Surely patience was better than recklessness, caution better than impulse. I had built my entire sense of adulthood around that belief. So I defended it. I told myself that people who just go for it are naive. That impulsive choices lead to regret. That responsibility means knowing when not to act. I framed my waiting as discipline, not fear. That framing had worked for years. Now it felt thin. Because when I looked honestly at my life, I saw how many things had been postponed not because they were dangerous, but because they were uncertain. Not because they were irresponsible, but because they couldn't be justified in advance. I wasn't avoiding disaster. I was avoiding vulnerability. I realized how often I waited for external validation before allowing myself to move. I waited for encouragement, for signs, for reassurance that I wouldn't be judged. I wanted proof that a choice would be accepted before I made it. In other words, I wanted safety. And I had mistaken safety for permission. I noticed how deeply this pattern ran. Even in small things. I hesitated before speaking my mind, waiting to see how others felt first. I delayed expressing preferences until I knew they wouldn't disrupt the group. I softened my opinions, adjusted my tone, edited myself constantly. I was always checking the room. Always calibrating. I had learned to read expectations with precision, and to shape myself accordingly. That skill had once protected me. It had kept me included, respected, unharmed. But now it was keeping me frozen. Because living this way meant that every meaningful step depended on approval that was never explicitly given. No one ever said, "Now you're allowed." They just kept living. And I kept waiting. I started to see how much of my identity was built around potential instead of action. I told myself I could do many things, later. That I would change certain aspects of my life, eventually. That I wasn't the kind of person who settled, just someone who hadn't started yet. Potential became my hiding place. As long as something was only postponed, it couldn't fail. As long as I hadn't acted, my imagined future self stayed intact, flawless, capable, untouched by reality. Reality, I realized, was what scared me. Not because it might be bad. But because it would be final. Once you choose, you can't keep all possibilities open. Once you act, you discover who you actually are, not who you might have been. Waiting preserved my fantasy. Living would test it. I began to feel a quiet grief, not for mistakes made, but for experiences never attempted. For conversations never started. For risks never taken. For versions of myself that remained theoretical. I wasn't grieving loss. I was grieving absence. I thought about how often I said, "I'm not ready," without defining what readiness meant. I realized I had no clear criteria. Readiness wasn't a state I was approaching, it was a concept I kept pushing forward. Every time I grew, the requirement grew with me. More confidence. More certainty. More proof. I would always be one step behind my own permission. That realization was unsettling. Because it meant I could spend my entire life preparing, and never arrive. I started noticing time differently. Not dramatically, not with panic, but with awareness. Days passed. Weeks folded into months. Moments that once felt distant began to feel closer. I wasn't old. But I wasn't infinite either. I realized that waiting had a cost I had never calculated. Not in missed achievements, but in muted experience. In living carefully instead of fully. In existing in anticipation instead of participation. The scariest part was admitting this: no one had asked me to wait. No one had set these conditions. The authority I was deferring to didn't exist outside of me. I had created an invisible gatekeeper for my own life, and then spent years trying to satisfy it. I began to ask myself a different question. Not when will I be ready? But what am I protecting myself from by waiting? The answer was uncomfortable. I was protecting myself from regret. From judgment. From the possibility of choosing wrong. From the pain of discovering that something I wanted might not fulfill me. Waiting kept me safe from disappointment. It also kept me untouched by meaning. I began to see that permission is rarely given. It's assumed. People don't wait until they are authorized to live. They move, stumble, adjust, regret, recover. They learn by doing. I had been trying to learn without doing. I had been trying to deserve a life instead of enter it. That realization didn't immediately change my behavior. But it changed something deeper. It removed my last excuse. If there was no permission coming, then the waiting wasn't noble. It was optional. And that meant something frightening and liberating at the same time: I could stop. Stopping the waiting didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where I stood up and declared that my life was finally beginning. No dramatic break, no sudden courage. Waiting had been my natural state for so long that abandoning it felt almost unnatural. What changed was simpler. I stopped asking for permission, not out loud, but internally. The first time I noticed it, it felt wrong. I made a small decision without checking whether it made sense, without asking myself if it was justified, without imagining how it would look later when explained. I didn't announce it. I didn't defend it. I just chose. Nothing spectacular happened. No one stopped me. No one objected. No one even noticed. That shook me more than resistance ever could. I realized how much power I had attributed to an authority that had never existed. How carefully I had obeyed rules that were never enforced. How long I had lived as if my life required approval that was never coming. Waiting had felt responsible. Choosing felt reckless. But reckless compared to what? Compared to a life that was already passing. I noticed how deeply ingrained my habit of delay was. Even after that first choice, my instinct was still to hesitate. To check. To justify. To ask myself if I had earned this step, if I deserved it, if it was appropriate yet. That voice didn't disappear. I just stopped obeying it automatically. I learned that permission isn't a switch you flip. It's a muscle you build. Every time I acted without waiting for certainty, that muscle strengthened slightly. Every time I allowed myself to experience something without knowing how it would turn out, something inside me relaxed. I didn't become fearless. I became willing. Willing to feel regret if it came. Willing to look foolish. Willing to discover that something I wanted wasn't as fulfilling as I imagined. Because regret, I realized, is easier to live with than absence. I had spent years avoiding mistakes, and in doing so, I had avoided experience. I had tried to ensure a future that made sense instead of inhabiting a present that felt alive. That trade-off no longer felt acceptable. I began to notice moments when life felt heavier, not in a bad way, but in a real way. Conversations where I spoke honestly without rehearsing. Choices that couldn't be fully explained. Paths that didn't come with guarantees. Those moments were uncomfortable. They were also vivid. For the first time, time felt textured again. Days didn't blur as easily. Decisions carried weight, not because they were perfect, but because they were mine. I grieved the years I had spent waiting. Not with bitterness. With understanding. Waiting had protected me when I didn't trust myself. It had given me structure when uncertainty felt overwhelming. It had allowed me to move slowly in a world that often demands too much, too fast. I don't hate that version of me. But I no longer let it decide for me. I learned that permission is a story we tell ourselves to postpone responsibility. A way to stay safe from judgment, from error, from the finality of choice. But life doesn't respond to permission. It responds to participation. No one ever came to tell me I was ready. No moment arrived where everything aligned and the fear disappeared. The only thing that changed was this: I stopped waiting to feel ready, and accepted that readiness comes after action, not before it. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the one who is always preparing, always improving, always almost ready, I want you to hear this without pressure. You don't need to justify your life before you live it. You don't need to earn the right to choose. You don't need permission to begin. Waiting feels safe. But it has a quiet cost. And one day, if you're not careful, you'll realize that you've become very good at waiting, and very distant from yourself. I spent my life waiting for permission. No one ever gave it. And when I finally stopped asking, I didn't become someone else. I simply stepped forward. Not confidently. Not perfectly. But honestly. And for the first time, that felt like enough.